In the village of St. Mary Mead, Christmas came not with a whisper, but with bells, carols, and a dusting of snow that turned hedgerows and rooftops into something out of a Victorian postcard. Fires crackled behind frosted windows, secrets simmered under tinsel and holly, and the good ladies of the parish committee fussed over mince pies and choir rehearsals as if their lives depended on it. But not all carols are sung in harmony. It was during the first verse of Hark. The Herald Angels Sing, in a church scented with pine and candle wax, that the doors creaked open and she appeared. Not in mourning black, nor in festive green. No. She wore red. Not the cheerful red of ribbons or berries, but a bold crimson that startled like spilled wine on white linen. And with that dress came a voice, clear, calm, and devastating. "I am Reginald Braithwaite's wife," she said. "The first. And the only lawful one." And just like that, the peace of Christmas shattered like glass underfoot. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the third pew with her hands folded over her muff, did not gasp. She did not whisper. But she did open her eyes wide and sharp as ever and thought to herself, "Now isn't that most peculiar?" Chapter 1. The carol interrupted. It was the sort of Christmas evening that poets imagined but rarely lived through. A gentle snowfall softened the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead. The gas lamps flickered with just enough haze to blur memory and light, and the old stone church of St. Edward's stood aglow like a lantern against the cold. Inside, the warmth was tangible, the scent of evergreen branches twined with beeswax and orange peel, the hush of wool coats and winter silks as neighbors settled into their pews. In the front rows sat the Braithwaite family, a vision of seasonal propriety. Widow Eleanor Braithwaite, swathed in black but dignified, held her lace handkerchief in still hands. To her right, her eldest daughter, Anne, was a portrait of filial reserve. Behind them sat Reginald Jr., flanked by his wife and their two fidgeting children, who were quickly hushed by a sharp maternal glance. The absence of Reginald Braithwaite himself, recently deceased, hung in the air like the final bell of Advent. The service began with a rustle of hymnals and the first note of the organ. The vicar, Reverend Chilton, welcomed the parish with customary cheer, inviting them to raise their voices in the opening carol. The choir, robed in crimson and cream, began softly, "Hark! The Herald Angels Sing." But they didn't get far. The door opened, not with a creak, but with the confident groan of old wood and brass hinges, and the bitter draught that swept in was not from the snow. Every head turned. Every note faltered. Even the organist's hands seemed to hesitate. She stood in the doorway like something from another world. Tall, striking, and far too confident for someone interrupting a Christmas carol, the woman wore a red coat, not festive cherry or hollyberry, but a deep, startling crimson, the color of lipstick too bold for church or blood spilled on linen. Beneath her fur-lined cloak was a dress of matching tone, impeccably tailored, clinging in a manner that suggested defiance rather than warmth. And upon her face, framed by a wide-brimmed hat with a crimson veil, was a look of poised certainty. Not grief. Not rage. Just certainty. No one moved. The silence was sudden and total, as if the angels themselves had stopped to listen. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, each heel clicking crisply against the stone. Her eyes never wavered. And as she passed the pews, the villagers of St. Mary Mead found themselves torn between two instincts, to look away from impropriety or to devour it with quiet scandal. Miss Jane Marple, sitting unobtrusively in the third pew on the left, did neither. She simply watched. Her gloved hands rested lightly on her handbag, her knitting tucked beside her. But her pale blue eyes, bright and birdlike beneath the rim of her hat, never left the stranger. The woman in red stopped before the Braithwaite family, and it was then that she spoke. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said. Her voice was low and cultured, with the kind of crisp enunciation that suggested finishing schools, or perhaps courtroom drama. "But I believe a grave mistake has been made." And Braithwaite gasped. Widow Eleanor turned, slow and deliberate, her expression shifting from confusion to a tension too complex for simple description. The Reverend stepped forward, faltering. "My name is Vivienne Braithwaite," the woman continued, raising her voice just enough to be heard by all. "And I am Reginald Braithwaite's wife." A full second passed before the congregation exhaled. Someone dropped a hymnal. Someone else coughed into their sleeve. One of the Braithwaite children began to cry and was quickly shushed. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "I am his legal wife," Vivienne repeated. "We were married in 1978 in Monte Carlo. I have the certificate. And while I understand you have enjoyed the benefits of his companionship, I am here to claim what is rightfully mine in legacy, if not in affection." The tension in the church broke like thin ice under too much weight. "What sort of performance is this?" asked Reginald Jr., rising to his feet. "Not a performance," Vivienne replied smoothly. "A correction. One Mr. Braithwaite neglected to make in life." Lies, and hissed. But Vivienne, the woman in red, was already reaching into her handbag. From it she drew a folded document, yellowed slightly at the edges, and handed it calmly to Reverend Chilton. "Read it," she said. "Or give it to someone who will." Miss Marple watched the Reverend's hands tremble slightly as he unfolded the page. His eyes scanned the document, his mouth opening, then closing again. He adjusted his glasses, then looked up with a pale expression of disbelief. "Well?" Eleanor demanded. The Reverend hesitated. "It appears to be authentic." "Though of course, no," Eleanor said sharply. "It is not. It cannot be. Reginald and I were married at this very altar 35 years ago. And yet," said Vivienne, turning slightly to face the congregation, "he never divorced me. So unless bigamy was part of your vows, I'm afraid we have a problem." The uproar that followed was not loud, but it was piercing. The rustle of whispered suspicion, the shift of scandal in skirts and shoulders, the quiet thrill of a story better than anything the vicar had planned for the evening. Miss Marple sat quite still, her gaze resting not on Vivienne or Eleanor, but on Reginald Jr. and the solicitor seated 2 rows behind him, Mr. Gregory Phelps, whose face had turned an interesting shade of grey. And the service never quite resumed. If you're enjoying this festive mystery, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chilling chapter. Leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from. We read every one. Chapter 2. The Braithwaite gathering the snow that fell that evening did so with the decorum of a shroud, muffling the village beneath a soft, deceptive peace. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay tranquil and untouched, the windows of its old cottages glowing with firelight and wreaths, ribbons, and illusion. But inside the Braithwaite residence, a stately Georgian manor on the far edge of the village green, warmth had nothing to do with comfort. The drawing-room fire snapped and hissed in its grate, wreaths hung stiffly on polished paneling, and the scent of cloves and pine did little to cover the staleness of something long buried and recently disturbed. Reginald Braithwaite had built the house brick by brick to impress his neighbors and secure his place among the village's more exalted circles. Now, with his sudden death barely a week behind them, his widow and children gathered beneath its roof not to mourn but to hold counsel. Tense, brittle, and haunted by the echo of a crimson-draped woman in a village church. Eleanor Braithwaite sat upright in her high-backed chair, the fire casting shadows along the stern lines of her face. Her black crepe dress was perfectly pressed, her pearls knotted with deliberate elegance, but her composure had frayed at the edges. She had not spoken a word since returning from the church, not even when Reginald Jr. had exploded with rage in the vestibule or when and had dissolved into tears halfway through her third sherry. Instead, she had stared into the fire as though Reginald himself might rise from the embers with an explanation. And, ever the dutiful daughter, perched on the edge of the settee, dabbing her eyes and muttering about scandal, about shame, about how it would look in the Gazette. Reginald Jr. paced. His voice had already worn itself hoarse with bluster. Fraud, lunatic, foul game, but he now stalked the room like a lion in a cage, his fury only sharpened by his inability to roar it into resolution. His wife, Margaret, had taken herself upstairs almost immediately upon their return, declaring a migraine, though Eleanor privately suspected she had simply grown weary of pretending to defend a family name that may have already crumbled beneath her feet. At the far end of the drawing-room, by the glass cabinet that held the Braithwaite silver, polished weakly by a maid now too afraid to make eye contact, stood Mr. Gregory Phelps, the family solicitor. His presence that evening had not been planned, but when he had turned up at the door only moments after they returned from the church, coat still flecked with snow and eyes darting behind round spectacles, Eleanor had wordlessly waved him in. He had since remained silent, clutching his briefcase as though it were a lifeline. Outside the window, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the Braithwaite garden, ostensibly admiring the snow-heavy holly bushes. She had walked home from the church at her usual unhurried pace, removed her coat, fed her cat, and promptly decided she required some air. The Braithwaite residence, after all, was only 2 doors down from her own, and there was something quite invigorating about the bracing cold and the delicate glow of scandal just beginning to thaw. From her position beneath the hedgerow arch, she could see into the drawing-room a flicker of an silk sleeve, a glimpse of Eleanor's profile against the firelight, the familiar stiff back of Mr. Phelps. And though her posture remained politely neutral, her mind was busy rearranging the pieces of the puzzle that had been thrown so rudely into the church earlier that evening. Inside, Reginald Jr. finally came to a stop near the sideboard, poured himself another 2 fingers of whiskey, and slammed the crystal stopper home with unnecessary force. "She's lying," he said, not for the first time. "Clearly lying. You all saw her, that red dress, that voice, it's a performance. No real wife would show up like that. Not at Christmas. Not in front of the children." Eleanor blinked slowly. "And yet," she said, her voice brittle as ice, "the certificate." Mr. Phelps shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "We mustn't assume authenticity until it's verified. These things can be fabricated." But there was little conviction behind the words. And looked up, blotchy and pale. "Is she even still in the village?" "She's taken a room at the 3 Swans," said Eleanor coldly. "Mrs. Berry phoned not half an hour ago. The woman in red has settled in. And she's asked to meet with me. Privately." Reginald's whiskey sloshed in his glass. "You won't, of course." "I haven't decided," said Eleanor. "But she says she has more documents. Letters. Things Reginald wrote her. She believes I should see them." Silence fell again. Long and tight. It was Mr. Phelps who broke it. "If it is true that Mr. Braithwaite never formally dissolved a prior marriage, then I must advise you that her claim could carry legal weight. The estate, the will, insurance policies, everything would be called into question. And let out a strangled sound. He wouldn't have done this. He couldn't. But even Eleanor said nothing. Her stillness had taken on a different shape now, less disbelief, more calculation. She was remembering, Miss Marple suspected, small absences. Business trips. Letters that had gone unanswered. A name that had once been overheard and brushed aside. The sort of memories that, when viewed through a crack in the curtain, turned from mundane to monstrous. Later that evening, after the Braithwaites had retired behind their thick drapes and bolted doors, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage and sat by her parlour window with a cup of cinnamon tea. The village lay still and picturesque. But the carol service had opened something. A trapdoor beneath the velvet of holiday tradition, and now the question was not whether a truth had been buried but how deeply and by whom. One thing, however, was already clear to Miss Marple. The woman in red had not appeared unarmed. Her weapon had not been a pistol or poison, but certainty and the well-timed disclosure of something that had waited far too long to be spoken aloud. And when truth comes late, especially in a place like St. Mary Mead, it rarely arrives alone. Don't miss the next chilling installment of Murder in the Carol. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the mystery, and leave a comment to share your favorite Miss Marple moment. We read every one. Chapter 3, The Letters and the Lost Page. The next morning dawned soft and grey, as though the sky itself had drawn a heavy breath and resolved to hold it. Snow lay in perfect hush upon the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, undisturbed and strangely fragile, like the silence that follows an accusation no one yet dares to answer. By mid-morning, rumours had already begun to steep through the village like oversteeped tea, bitter, astringent, and impossible to hear. Mrs. Price at the post office had already shared with Mrs. Weatherby that the woman in red had a continental accent and cheekbones like a French duchess. Meanwhile, Mr. Tutt the grocer declared he'd seen her smoking a cigarette with a gold holder outside the Three Swans, like some film actress from the wrong sort of picture. But Miss Marple, having endured the unspoken scandals of St. Mary Mead for most of her life, knew the most dangerous rumours were never spoken so loudly. They crept, like ivy, through drawing rooms and china cabinets, curling into judgment without ever appearing to grow at all. Vivienne Braithwaite, for that was the name she had claimed, had not fled, nor hidden herself. She remained precisely where she had chosen to be, room 3 at the Three Swans Inn, overlooking the village square and the frost-laced statue of Admiral Pembroke. She had breakfasted in her room, sent a note requesting an appointment with the vicar. For spiritual clarity, she had written and instructed Mrs. Berry, the innkeeper, to press her crimson dress should another occasion arise. And though few villagers had dared speak to her directly, nearly all of them had paused outside the inn that morning, peering upward, glancing sideways, their curiosity far stronger than their discretion. Miss Marple, for her part, was already 3 steps ahead. After tea and toast, she had dressed in her winter woolens and made her way to St. Edward's Church, not to pray, but to tidy. That had been her word when she gently offered her help to Reverend Chilton's harried wife. I thought I might do a bit of tidying. With everything so festive still. It was the sort of offer no one ever refused from Miss Marple, particularly when the alternative was managing disarray after a ruined carol service. And so it was that Miss Marple found herself alone in the nave, her gloved hands brushing over hymnals and velvet cushions, her gaze drifting slowly but deliberately across the pews, the altar, and the scattered fragments of human error. It was in the 3rd pew, the very same she had occupied during the carol service, that she found the first of the oddities. Tucked between the pages of it came upon a midnight clear, and in the bleak midwinter was something entirely out of place. A folded envelope, yellowed with age, sealed in the sort of wax one might associate with weddings, wills, or romantic mischief. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before slipping it into her handbag. She had, over the years, learned that the church was as good a place for secrets as it was for absolution. Meanwhile, across the village, Eleanor Braithwaite had at last answered Vivienne's request for a meeting. At precisely 11 o'clock, she stepped out of her front door, her hat straight, her mouth set, and her gloves impeccably buttoned, and made her way to the Three Swans, where Vivienne greeted her not with triumph but with the calm resignation of a woman too long denied a place at the table. No one overheard what passed between them, but Mrs. Berry, the innkeeper, later noted that when Eleanor left, she walked slightly slower than when she'd arrived. Not with the weight of defeat, but with the burden of something freshly remembered. That afternoon, a peculiar tension hung over the village like a scent, not unpleasant, but charged. At the solicitor's office, Mr. Phelps was uncharacteristically brusque, having spent the morning rifling through Reginald Braithwaite's files for the original copy of his last will, a task made more complicated by the discovery that one of the pages was missing. Page 4, to be exact. A single sheet, referenced in the table of contents, its absence explained by no ordinary disorder. Page 4, Phelps recalled, contained the codicil, the amendment that listed specific inheritance provisions for persons unnamed in the initial draft. And now it was gone. Removed, it seemed, with precision. Miss Marple, upon hearing this from a very pink and flustered Mr. Phelps later that day in the High Street, nodded as though she were discussing a pie crust recipe. She asked whether Reginald's copy of the will, surely he had kept one at home, had been located. Mr. Phelps admitted that Eleanor had not found it, though she was still searching. Miss Marple made a quiet sound in her throat and mentioned, in passing, how terribly damp old attics could be this time of year. She then excused herself to visit the vicarage. Inside her handbag, beside her neatly folded gloves, the envelope she had retrieved from the hymn book remained unopened until that evening. It was only once her curtains were drawn and her kettle had begun to whistle that Miss Marple removed the envelope, broke the seal with a letter opener shaped like a bird's wing, and unfolded the paper within. It was, as she suspected, a letter addressed to my dearest V, dated Christmas Eve, 1984, and signed, rather unambiguously, R. The letter was short, handwritten in dark ink, and filled with an intimacy that defied any notion of casual affection. In it, Reginald Braithwaite spoke of the agony of silence, of a season meant for truth, and, most curiously, of the page I have torn, the page that names you. Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, then tucked it carefully between the pages of her gardening almanac. By now, the story of the woman in red had shifted in tone. No longer was she merely a disruption in the church service or a scandal in a red coat. She had become something more dangerous, a woman with paperwork, a past, and patience. And when a woman with patience begins to speak of proof, the foundations of respectability begin to tremble. Miss Marple sat back in her armchair, her knitting untouched on her lap, and listened to the grandfather clock tick toward midnight. Outside, the snow began again, light, then heavier. As though something hidden beneath it still refused to stay buried. Enjoying Murder in the Carol? Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chilling chapter. And let us know in the comments what you think the woman in red is still hiding. We read everyone. Chapter 4, The Carol and the Codicil. The snowfall had thickened by morning, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a hushed stillness that felt almost reverent. It clung to the hedgerows like lace and hung in gentle folds from rooftops and eaves, transforming the village into a Christmas card so picturesque it nearly obscured the rising storm beneath. For those walking the high street, bundled against the cold with mufflers and market baskets, conversation turned not to turkey or trifles or whether the vicar would brave his annual sleigh ride. No, the only subject that passed in whispered fragments was her. The woman in red. The interloper. The uninvited ghost of a long-buried truth now walking, alive and determined, beneath holly wreaths and gas lamps. Inside the Three Swans Inn, Vivienne Braithwaite sat at a small writing desk near the window of room 3. Her hair was swept back into a chignon, and she wore a dark green wool dress that, while less theatrical than the infamous crimson, did little to soften the impact of her presence. She held a fountain pen with fingers as steady as her voice had been at the carol service, and before her lay a half-finished letter addressed to the London solicitor whose name Miss Marple would later recognise, a name long associated with legal disputes of delicate nature. On the desk beside the inkwell sat a tidy stack of documents. Certified copies of her marriage certificate from Monte Carlo dated 1978, letters exchanged over 20 years between herself and Reginald, and, most significantly, a black leather folder bearing the Braithwaite family crest in faded gold, the original will, unsigned but unmistakably real, missing one page. She was preparing for something, a reckoning, perhaps, and though no one in the village yet knew its details, the shape of it was beginning to cast long shadows across hearth and pew. Miss Marple, however, had long since stopped relying on shadows. That morning, she took her tea with only a single sugar, a sign, for those who knew her, that her mind was more engaged than her taste buds, and read the previous evening's letter again. The Christmas Eve note from Reginald to my dearest V was not merely affectionate. It was a confession in lace, poetic but pointed. The reference to the page I have torn spoke volumes to anyone who knew the workings of wills and the heart, and Miss Marple had spent enough of her life among both to understand that no man wrote such things unless he expected not to be heard again. His language bore the signature of a man haunted not by regret, but by decision. A decision that someone, quite likely, had intercepted before it could become legal fact. That afternoon, she made her way to the vicarage. Not with her usual knitting in tow, but with purpose. The Reverend and his wife, still recovering from the scandalized disruption of their most sacred service, welcomed her with gratitude. She stayed only long enough to ask a single question: had any choir books or hymnals gone missing following the service? The Reverend blinked, puzzled, and directed her to Mrs. Withers, the parish clerk, who reported, with a great deal of pride and an unnecessary amount of floral perfume, that yes, in fact, 2 hymnals had been temporarily displaced. The altos had theirs mixed up, you see, she said, and one turned up in the bell tower the next morning, the other behind the pulpit. Strange, that. But strange things were becoming something of a pattern. Meanwhile, the Braithwaite residence had entered a sort of voluntary lockdown. Since Eleanor's private meeting with Vivienne the day before, the family had withdrawn from public view, save for Reginald Jr., who had been spotted at the bank, looking pale and impatient, and Anne, who had been overheard asking Mrs. Jameson at the florist whether yellow lilies might be more dignified than red. Eleanor, however, remained indoors, her presence unannounced and her temperament unreadable. Rumors whispered that she had begun sorting Reginald's belongings. Others said she was preparing to leave the village entirely. But Miss Marple suspected otherwise. Eleanor Braithwaite was not a woman who ran from battle, she was a woman who chose the battlefield. It was the discovery of the codicil that turned whispers into something colder. Mr. Gregory Phelps, ever cautious and sweating slightly through his collar, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that evening with a confession. "It appears," he began, setting his briefcase on the table with trembling hands, "that the will you inquired about Reginald's original may have been revised after all. I located a draft in my office. Locked file. Untouched since July. There's mention of a codicil, handwritten, dated November. But the page has vanished." His eyes darted about, as if expecting someone to rise from behind Miss Marple's lace curtains. It listed an unnamed beneficiary. No title, no relation. Just an instruction, to be recognized with provision, according to mutual understanding. Quite ambiguous. But the handwriting, it's unmistakably his. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but alert. She asked if the envelope had been tampered with. Mr. Phelps admitted that the seal had been broken, but he had assumed it had been done during their previous review. "It hadn't," Miss Marple said quietly. "Had it?" Later that night, as the fire in her sitting room crackled and the snow outside thickened to silence, Miss Marple laid out the pieces like patches for a quilt. A missing page from a will. A handwritten letter confessing to its removal. A woman with marriage documents and 20 years of affection in writing. A solicitor with convenient memory lapses. A family rattled by more than just the idea of bigamy, they were threatened by legitimacy. For if Vivienne were telling the truth, and Miss Marple increasingly believed that she was, then everything Reginald had built could be split, revised, undone. Not merely financially. Reputation, legacy, place in the village. All of it could be stained, ruined, inherited by someone who had never been welcome inside the Braithwaite gates. And then, just as she was preparing to retire for the night, the bell rang. It was a page from the vicarage, young Timothy Flint, cap askew, cheeks pink with cold, carrying a crumpled envelope and a breathless message. "Mrs. Marple, she asked me to bring this. The woman from the inn. She said it's important. Said you'd know what to do with it." Miss Marple thanked him, closed the door, and slowly unfolded the paper. Inside was a torn piece of what looked to be a legal document, handwritten, aged, and bearing the words, "I recognize the bond one share with V and wish that, should my intention be challenged, this codicil be regarded as my last and final wish." It was unsigned. Torn clean through the signature line. But the ink matched the letter in her almanac, and the handwriting, she had no doubt, was Reginald's. Miss Marple looked at the envelope again. It was sealed with red wax. And on the back, in ink that trembled ever so slightly, a message had been added: "If I am not heard, let her be seen." Chapter 5. The guest in red. It was the sort of morning that wore quiet like a veil, the kind where even the birds kept their songs tucked beneath their wings. The snow had hardened overnight, settling into a sheen of glassy frost that crunched beneath boots and left white scars upon cobblestone paths. St. Mary Mead rose slowly from slumber that day, its windows glowing gently behind drawn curtains, as if the village had agreed in silent pact to pause. To delay the world just long enough for the warmth of holiday illusion to endure one more hour. But by the time the sun had crested the low roofs of the high street, the illusion had begun to crack. And before the bells could toll 9, word had already reached Miss Marple's doorstep: the woman in red was dead. They found her at the Three Swans just after breakfast, or rather, at the absence of one. Mrs. Berry, the innkeeper, had sent young Mary up with a tray. A soft-boiled egg, a slice of toast with damson jam, and a pot of Earl Grey, as she had every morning since Vivienne's arrival. The girl knocked once, then twice. When no answer came, she knocked again. Polite at first, Mary would say later, but then worried. She was always awake, always reading or writing or humming at the window like she was waiting for something. After a few moments more, Mary fetched Mrs. Berry, and together they opened the door with the innkeeper's passkey. Vivienne Braithwaite lay fully clothed atop the coverlet, her shoes neatly set at the bedside, her lipstick still intact, her hands folded as though in repose. The room smelled faintly of roses and something acrid beneath, a scent not unfamiliar to those who kept under-the-counter cleaning products or remembered the great Warsfield infirmaries. On the nightstand sat a glass, empty but for a crystalline film. And beside it, a note. Short. Folded in half. Addressed not to a name, but a village. To St. Mary Mead, it read. The doctor arrived first, Dr. Chesterfield, whose greying moustache and limp lent him an air of solemn expertise, followed closely by the constable, a young man named Hodge with a prematurely furrowed brow and the well-meaning hesitation of one who rarely investigated anything more sinister than missing sheep or library disputes. The doctor's verdict was not definitive, but it was efficient: cyanide, taken likely within the last 6 to 8 hours. Quick, unpleasant, and deliberate, he muttered. Assuming the note confirms it. But it didn't. The note, as it happened, contained only a single line: I was never meant to outlive the truth. No signature. No date. No apology. Only that single, haunting sentence, damning in its ambiguity, cruel in its elegance. And with it, the village's scandal turned solemn. The whispers, once sharp with judgment, dulled to murmurs tinged with guilt. Vivienne Braithwaite. The intruder, the claimant, the woman who dared to disrupt Christmas, had died not with fury, but with finality. And in her silence, she seemed to leave behind more questions than she had answered. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news from Reverend Chilton's wife, who arrived, breathless and pale, to relay the grim tidings with trembling teacup in hand, said nothing for nearly a full minute. She simply sat by her parlor window, eyes fixed upon the slow-falling snow, her expression unreadable. When at last she spoke, it was to ask what other note had been found. 8:30, came the reply. She hadn't come down, and Mrs. Berry was concerned. Miss Marple nodded once. Then she rose, excused herself, and set out walking. The Three Swans stood solemn, its windows drawn and the innkeeper distraught but dutiful. Miss Marple was permitted access to the room, escorted by young Constable Hodge, who clearly viewed her presence with the mixture of awe and anxiety reserved for village royalty. "Just don't touch anything, if you please," he said, to which Miss Marple smiled mildly and replied, "Oh, I never do." The room was undisturbed. The bed, still smooth beneath the body's imprint. The note, now photographed and bagged, had been removed. But Miss Marple's attention turned not to what was missing, but to what had remained. The suitcase, still latched at the base of the armoire. A single pair of gloves laid carefully over the back of the chair. And on the writing desk, perhaps the most telling detail, a sheet of parchment torn from the Braithwaite stationery collection, its edges uneven, as though ripped in haste. Ink stains dotted the corner, and beneath the blotting paper, a faint indent could still be seen, the ghost of a sentence abandoned before it found its shape. Miss Marple requested a moment alone. Constable Hodge, after a moment's internal debate, granted her 5 minutes and stepped outside. And in that moment, Miss Marple reached into her handbag, removed the torn fragment Vivienne had sent her the previous night, and laid it atop the desk. The edges matched. Precisely. It was not just a copy of the codicil, it was the original page, torn by hand, removed deliberately, and hidden beneath pretense until it could be no longer. Vivienne had not intended to die. That much was now clear to Miss Marple. She had been preparing something. Not an escape, but a reveal. The woman in red, for all her drama, had never seemed the type to retreat. Her poise had not been performance, it had been principle. Which meant someone else had reason to silence her. Someone close. Someone who had everything to lose. And someone who had waited until her story had just begun to be believed. Outside, the village pulsed with shocked silence. Eleanor Braithwaite did not leave her home that day, and was reportedly under sedation. Reginald Jr. made a brief, tense appearance at the bank, then vanished. Mr. Phelps, the solicitor, had not returned to his office and could not be reached by telephone. And at the Three Swans, Mrs. Berry sat behind the front desk with a knitted shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, repeating to no one in particular, she was so very calm. So very calm. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned home and sat once more beneath her sitting-room clock, which now ticked with a rhythm that felt less like time and more like warning. She opened her notebook and began to write. Not guesses, Miss Marple did not believe in guessing, but certainties cloaked as curiosities. The envelope Vivienne had sent. The half-written letter. The missing codicil. The conveniently timed death. And the scent, faint, but familiar, of almond on the glass beside her bed. Cyanide. Common enough in theory, rare in practice. Difficult to procure, unless one had means or motive. And here, in St. Mary Mead, she suspected there were more than one who possessed both. The timing was too precise. The note too poetic. The facts, too staged. If Vivienne had taken her own life, it would have been for defeat, but she had not been defeated. She had been close. So close. And someone had known it. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her gaze lingering on the window, where the snow fell slower now, as though winter itself was listening. A murder, at Christmas. A silenced woman. A missing page. And a village that wanted so very badly for the world to remain as it was, untouched, unchanged, and unchallenged. But Miss Marple knew better. You won't want to miss what happens next in Murder in the Carol. Subscribe now for the next chapter, and let us know your theory. Do you think Vivienne truly planned to take her own life? Or did someone make sure she couldn't tell more? We read every one. Chapter 6, Fruitcake and Formaldehyde. There is a peculiar stillness that falls upon a village after a death, not the panicked hush of disaster, but the deliberate quiet of collective unease. St. Mary Mead, now cloaked in snow that sparkled deceptively in the December sunlight, moved more slowly in the days following the death of the woman in red. Doors closed a little earlier. Curtains stayed drawn a little longer. Conversations trailed off when footsteps passed too close. It was the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from something else entirely, fear. For if Vivienne Braithwaite, stranger, scandal-bearer, truth-teller, could die beneath such quiet skies, what might happen next? And to whom? The answer came far sooner than anyone expected. It began innocuously enough. A small gathering was held at the vicarage, as was traditional in the week before Christmas. A modest afternoon tea with hymns, carols, and a cheerful display of holly and ivy festooned crackers arranged by Mrs. Chilton herself. The attendees were few, thinned by the shadow that had fallen over the village, but present nonetheless were Miss Marple, the church's elderly organist Mr. Lowry, and Gregory Phelps, the Braithwaite family solicitor, who had arrived 10 minutes late, coat askew, cheeks flushed not from cold but from anxiety only partly masked by politeness. His presence, though unexpected, was not wholly out of place. Mr. Phelps had long been a staple of village affairs, and though he never quite fit comfortably into social gatherings, he had earned a sort of deferential tolerance among the community, provided he kept to tea and small talk. But Miss Marple noted at once that something was wrong. It was not merely the man's appearance, though his shirt collar was damp with sweat despite the room's mild temperature. Nor was it the tremor in his hand as he reached for the teacup, nor even the occasional glance toward the vicar's clock, as though measuring the seconds. No, it was the absence of something. Confidence. He was a man eroded, wearing guilt like a film over his skin. And then there was the fruit cake. Mrs. Chilton had prepared it herself, a dense, rich affair laced with rum, studded with candied peel, and wrapped lovingly in marzipan. She offered it as tradition demanded, slicing carefully and offering each piece with a smile. Mr. Phelps hesitated at first, then took one, offered a hollow laugh, and murmured something about comfort in customs. He ate slowly, mechanically. Miss Marple, sitting across from him, did not eat hers at all. Less than 20 minutes later, he was dead. It happened in the study, where Mr. Phelps had excused himself, claiming a need to retrieve a paper, a clarification. When he did not return, the vicar went to check on him. Miss Marple, sensing something shift in the air, followed close behind. They found him slumped at the writing desk, the paper still clutched in one hand, his lips tinged with an unnatural blue. There was no note this time. No apology. Only the unmistakable signs of poisoning, and the grim finality of a man whose secrets had finally caught him. The doctor arrived swiftly, more prepared than before. And though official results would take days, there was no ambiguity in Dr. Chesterfield's tone. Poison. Fast-acting. Not ingested earlier than 15 minutes before collapse. He turned to the vicar, who blanched. The fruitcake? Mrs. Chilton gasped, horrified, but Miss Marple shook her head gently. I believe the fruitcake was only a vessel, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. It was not poisoned before it arrived. I saw her slice it with my own eyes. No, the method was more personal. And recent. By the time the constable arrived, his young face pale with the gravity of a second sudden death in as many days, Miss Marple had already begun piecing together what others would take days to even suspect. Gregory Phelps had not died at random. Nor had Vivienne. Their deaths were connected by more than proximity or timing. They shared a thread. A document, torn and tampered with, a truth too dangerous to be signed, and a name too dangerous to be spoken aloud. That evening, Miss Marple returned home through streets still dusted with snow but now silent with dread. Inside her cottage, she set down her gloves, lit her lamp, and opened her notebook again. 2 deaths. One silent. One sudden. Both tied, unmistakably, to Reginald Braithwaite's estate. The codicil, now verified in fragments, had threatened everything. It had named Vivienne, indirectly or otherwise, as an intended beneficiary. But its existence had been hidden. Phelps had found it, or at least known of it. Had he been complicit in its disappearance? Miss Marple suspected yes. But if so, why die now? Why attend the tea? Why show his face, if guilt was already tightening its noose? Unless he had come to confess. She thought back to his eyes, the way they darted not with fear, but resolution. A man unburdening himself. A man who knew the hourglass was nearly spent. And then, the paper in his hand, still unsurrendered. The constable had taken it, bagged it, but she had seen the edge, familiar parchment, thick stock, a watermark from a London law firm. Another piece of the puzzle. Another truth, perhaps, buried beneath the very man who had tried to hide it. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea she did not drink. Her thoughts turned briefly to Reginald Jr., whose temper had grown darker in recent days and whose finances, it was whispered, had not withstood the pressures of his father's delayed probate. And delicate, nervous, brittle, and whose recent quietness was, to Miss Marple, more unsettling than her earlier hysteria. And Eleanor, composed, elegant, and utterly impenetrable. A woman who had weathered scandal before, and perhaps would again, but only if she could keep her world precisely as it was. She could not yet say who had administered the poison. But she could say this: it had not been done in haste, nor in panic. It had been measured, chosen, placed with care into the hands of a man who may have been preparing to shift the blame or unveil the truth. And it had been done under the illusion of peace, of warmth, of Christmas. That illusion was now shattered. Outside, the village square lay quiet. The Christmas lights glowed faintly, and the wreaths on the doors seemed suddenly out of place, too cheerful, too naive. And at the Three Swans, a room still lay empty, its window facing the church spire like a forgotten witness. Miss Marple sat back, the ticking of her clock loud now in the hush. She had lived long enough to know that once death comes in twos, it rarely stops at a pair. The past was stirring in St. Mary Mead, and someone, somewhere, was growing desperate. What are your theories about the second death in Murder in the Carol? Subscribe now to receive the next thrilling chapter, and drop your suspicions in the comments. Who do you think is hiding behind the holiday cheer? We read every one. Chapter 7, The Vanishing of Reginald Jr. Snow had fallen again in the night, not the feathery sort that flits and dances, but a heavier, pressing snow that clung to everything it touched and left behind a hush so profound it might have been mistaken for peace. But there was no peace now in St. Mary Mead, only the muffled footsteps of fear. The death of Gregory Phelps had sunk into the village like a stone into a well, visible only at the surface before vanishing beneath. There were murmurs, of course, the kind that shivered across teacups and crept through post-office lines, but none dared speak too loudly, as though naming death again might summon it closer. And then, just when the hush began to feel like a kind of numbness, it happened. Reginald Braithwaite Jr. disappeared. It was a Monday, a cold, crystalline sort of day when the sky looks like glass and the breath of chimneys rises in slow, solemn curls. Mrs. Chilton, who had gone to visit Eleanor Braithwaite under the pretext of returning a borrowed hymn book, was the first to notice. He wasn't at the breakfast table, she confided later, her voice tight with restrained drama. And Eleanor looked as though she hadn't slept. Indeed, not only had Reginald Jr. missed breakfast, but also tea, lunch, and his daily walk to the bank, a routine as fixed as the clock on the church tower. By noon, the household admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. The eldest Braithwaite was nowhere to be found. Miss Marple received the news not from Mrs. Chilton, but from young Timothy Flint, who came knocking at her cottage with cheeks pink from the wind and worry twisting in his mittened hands. "My mum says he's gone," he said, eyes wide. "Vanished. Like in the ghost stories." But Miss Marple knew better than to believe in ghosts. She believed in guilt. And guilt, as she often said, had a habit of walking on two very human feet. By the time the constable arrived at the Braithwaite house, the drawing-room had been stripped of its usual grace. Eleanor sat upright on a velvet settee, her gloves still on, her eyes fixed on the unlit hearth as though daring the cold to creep any closer. And was nowhere to be seen, though the distant sound of a piano note wrong, discordant, suggested she was attempting once again to master the first bars of the first Noel, albeit with trembling fingers. The constable asked questions. When did anyone last see Reginald? Had he packed a bag? Left a note? Gone to the train? But no, the room was still in order. His coat and scarf hung on the peg. His boots were by the fire. His room was untouched. There was, quite simply, no sign of departure. Only absence. Clean, surgical, unnerving. Miss Marple arrived shortly after, her coat buttoned to the collar, her bonnet dusted with snowflakes that she did not bother to shake off. She listened as Eleanor recited what little there was to recount. Reginald had gone to his study the night before after supper. He had not emerged. When morning came, his bed had not been slept in. But the doors were locked. The windows latched. Nothing was missing. Only him. The study, when Miss Marple entered, bore the stale scent of tobacco and something fainter, something that made her pause, just for a second, before she opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Folded with care, bound with string. At a glance, they appeared harmless banking forms, correspondence, receipts. But one envelope stood out. Not for what it was, but for where it was placed, hidden beneath the lining, tucked between the baseboard and drawer bottom. With a hand as steady as ever, Miss Marple lifted it free. It was addressed to Father, in Reginald Jr.'s bold hand. Unsent. Unopened. She did not read it, not yet. But pocketed it gently before turning her eyes to the fireplace. The ashes were undisturbed. No papers burned. No diary pages turned to smoke. This was not a man who intended to vanish. This was a man who had stumbled upon something and been removed. Outside, the village had begun to stir with talk. Some said Reginald had fled. Others believed he had followed Vivien's path not by poison, but by despair. A few, the more dramatic, whispered that perhaps he had never truly belonged here at all, and now, with the truth of his father's legacy cracking open like an egg, he had found the exit door and taken it. Miss Marple thought otherwise. She walked home slowly, the letter burning quietly in her pocket, her thoughts racing beneath her calm expression. Reginald Jr. had been angry, that much had always been clear. But he had not been foolish. His rage had edges to it, not recklessness. And now, with two bodies fallen, one a truth-teller, one a truth-hider, he had vanished not in defeat, but after discovering something dangerous. Of that, Miss Marple was increasingly certain. That evening, by firelight, she read the letter. It was short, unfinished, but laced with urgency. Reginald Jr. had written of betrayal not by Vivien, but by someone closer than blood. He mentioned old records, forged hands, and a sum of money redirected through the vestry account. He spoke of something he found hidden, buried in a locked drawer at the solicitor's office, and he ended abruptly, the final words trailing into a blot of ink as though interrupted mid-thought. Miss Marple sat very still. It was not only murder that had crept into St. Mary Mead. It was manipulation, deliberate and strategic, a tightening noose woven with history, paperwork, and holiday cheer. Someone had known exactly how to make a death look like despair. And now, it seemed, they knew how to make a disappearance look like cowardice. But Miss Marple was not so easily misled. She rose, took her coat, and walked once more into the snowy night, toward the vicarage, where records were kept and secrets buried beneath names written in delicate ink. If Reginald Jr. had uncovered something in those church ledgers, it had not been by accident. And if he had vanished because of it, it was no accident either. Someone was protecting something. Not just wealth, not just reputation, but a story. One so tangled in legacy and lies that it had already cost 2 lives, and now perhaps a third. And Miss Marple, with her soft voice and her sharper mind, intended to unearth it before the snow buried one more truth forever. Chapter 8. The ledger beneath the holly. The snow fell harder that evening, thickening into a curtain that blurred the line between roof and sky, and gave the lamplight the soft, buttery glow of candlelit secrets. In St. Mary Mead, the world outside appeared wrapped in gift paper, white, pristine, picturesque, and impossibly still. But within the ancient walls of St. Edward's Church, that postcard piece cracked like thin ice beneath a careful footstep. Miss Marple stood once more within the nave, the scent of incense faint but lingering from the morning's Advent prayers, the air still and cold, save for the gentle creak of the rafters and the rhythmic ticking of the brass pendulum clock above the organ loft. Though the altar remained decorated with garlands and candles, and though a wreath of red ribbon adorned the baptismal font, there was nothing festive in the air tonight. Only the kind of silence reserved for confessions long overdue. She had come not to pray, but to investigate, and though she did so with the deference owed to sacred space, her mission was practical, resolute, and bound, she believed, to unravel something dark beneath all this seasonal tinsel. Miss Marple did not carry suspicion lightly. She had lived long enough to know that people, especially English people, buried truth beneath manners, beneath hymns, beneath traditions so entrenched they might strangle rather than preserve. And it was precisely because of that desire to protect appearances at all costs, that the truth had managed to remain hidden this long. The vicar, Reverend Chilton, had reluctantly given her access to the church's record room, not because he understood the scope of what she sought, but because she had asked with a kind of soft inevitability that left no room for protest. He had pressed the brass key into her gloved hand, quietly muttering, "Do be careful with the paper," before retreating to his study with the air of a man who preferred not to know what he had allowed. The record room was small, a narrow, dusty chamber behind the vestry, reached by descending 5 uneven stone steps and ducking beneath an archway too low for anyone taller than a village matron. Miss Marple had brought with her a lantern and her handbag, the latter containing her notebook, a soft pencil, and a flask of tea which, she admitted to herself, she would likely forget to drink. The shelves were crowded with ledgers bound in cracked leather, the sort of tomes that bore years in gold-embossed spines, baptisms 1911 to 1930, marriages 1895 to 1942, burials, donations, vestry minutes. She ran a finger along the dusty edges, pausing only when she reached the volume labeled Miscellaneous Accounts 1975 to 1985. It was heavier than the rest. She lifted it to the table, opened its brittle cover, and began to read. For nearly an hour she turned pages, her finger tracing lines of neat ink, her eyes narrowing slightly at every column entry. Most were what one would expect. Donations from the Braithwaites and the Fortescues, collections tallied from the Harvest Festival, repair expenses for the roof and the stained glass window above the Lady Chapel. But then, wedged between ordinary entries for December 1978, she saw it. A single payment, in an unfamiliar hand. £750, pastoral stipendiary assistance, registry matter, signed only with initials, R.B. The ink was darker than the surrounding pages, as though added later, and the penmanship lacked the formal, looping neatness of the other entries. She flipped to the appendix. No mention. It had been inserted without corresponding record. A payment made in cash. Unlisted, except here. What registry matter? And why in that year, the year Vivienne Braithwaite claimed to have married Reginald Braithwaite in Monte Carlo? Miss Marple turned back 3 pages, then forward 5. She cross-referenced the payment with the vestry minutes. Nothing. No mention of registry assistance. No vote. No discussion. It was as if the payment had existed outside the structure of the church's operation. A private transaction, slipped inside a public ledger like a letter folded between pages of a novel. But there was more. The ledger had been altered. Faint marks remained beneath the entry, rubbed out, imperfectly, where a previous notation had once been. Using the side of her pencil lightly, she shaded the area, and the ghost of old words rose from the page like dust from a shuttered room. Marriage banns correction, duplicate entry removed. And beneath that, a date, the 15th of December, 1978. Her pulse slowed. There it was. A clerical erasure, or perhaps a deliberate one, in the same month Vivienne and Reginald had reportedly married. Someone had paid to alter the church records. Someone had removed the banns. The public notice of an intended marriage, and in doing so, erased any evidence that the parish had ever acknowledged Reginald's earlier marriage. It had been subtle, quiet, concealed beneath a Christmas donation log and a bill for seasonal poinsettias. But the truth had been hidden here, under tinsel and tidings. And now, it had been found. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently and reached for another, the Marriages 1970 to 1985 volume. She turned to the section for December 1980, the year Eleanor and Reginald were married in St. Edward's, and found the official entry perfectly intact, witnessed by the vicar's predecessor and signed by Eleanor's brother. But what caught her eye was not the entry itself, but the spacing. There was a gap 2 pages between the late 1979 weddings and the early 1981 list. And in that gap, glue residue. Torn paper fibers. A page had been removed. Carefully. Surgically. Perhaps even with a knife. She had seen such things before: church thefts, altered baptism dates to avoid scandal. But this was no accident. This was part of a larger deceit. A second marriage formalized despite an existing union. A lie dressed in wedding lace. And someone had paid to have it blessed by omission. Her lantern dimmed slightly, and she turned up the flame, sitting back in her chair and letting her thoughts settle like snowflakes on stone. Vivienne had come not to stir trouble, but to rectify a wrong. And now, with her dead, Phelps dead, and Reginald Jr. vanished, the pattern was clear. Someone was killing to preserve a legacy, not just money, but the Braithwaite name, its lineage, its right to stand unblemished in the village's collective memory. And yet that legacy had been built not on virtue, but on manipulation, on redacted lines and payments made in the shadows. The Braithwaite fortune was tied not only to land and stocks but to an insurance policy. One that, she recalled from the public notice in the Gazette, had recently doubled in payout following Reginald's accidental death in a boating fall. And that clause, that phrase, accidental death, now took on a new gravity. Had Reginald Braithwaite truly died in a boating accident? Or had someone nudged fate along to trigger the policy's maximum payout? She would need to see the coroner's report. And the policy details. And she always found a way. But for now, she gathered her things, extinguished the lantern, and left the church's records precisely as she had found them, save for one marked page she quietly slid into her handbag, just in case anyone else attempted a second erasure. As she locked the chamber behind her and stepped into the nave, the bells tolled midnight. Outside, the village slept beneath its blanket of false serenity. But within her, Miss Marple felt something stir. A clarity, a path, a rising certainty that the truth was near. It had been hidden beneath carols and Christmas cheer, beneath registry logs and ribboned lies. But it was rising now. And before this holiday ended, someone would answer for it, not to St. Mary Mead, but to justice. If you're enjoying Murder in the Carol, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Who do you think tore the bands from the book? Could the insurance clause be the true motive all along? Share your theories, we read every one. Chapter 9. The Gift Beneath the Tree. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the village of St. Mary Mead, though draped in its usual Yuletide charm, now bore the brittle atmosphere of a house smiling too hard during mourning. The market stalls still sold chestnuts and ginger biscuits, and the gas lamps along the high street flickered warm halos onto cobbled pavements, but the eyes that passed one another above scarf-covered mouths did so with caution. Too many oddities had occurred in too few days, too much death, too much vanishing, and far too much silence for a community accustomed to knowing each other's business. At the Braithwaite house, the great fir tree in the drawing-room had finally been decorated. There had been no ceremony, no gathering of family to hang baubles and ribbons. Instead, it had appeared fully dressed one morning, its branches heavy with glass ornaments, red velvet boughs, and antique candle holders. The kind that looked lovely but hadn't been lit in years. At its base were a handful of wrapped boxes, hastily prepared, arranged more for tradition than sentiment. And nestled among them was a package no one remembered placing, small, square, wrapped in brown paper and twine. A gift without a name. A gift that should not have been there. Miss Marple had arrived just as Eleanor was noticing it, her expression cool, her voice a whisper of tension. "That was not here yesterday," she said. "It's nothing. Likely one of Anne's silly gestures." But Miss Marple, who had come not for tea, but under the pretense of returning a scarf she claimed Eleanor had dropped at the vicarage, saw immediately what others would overlook. The box was too plain. Too deliberately plain. Among the ornate wrappings and lace-tied parcels, it stood out precisely because it did not try to blend in. A disguise, she thought. And someone had placed it there with purpose. She asked gently whether she might examine it. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded curtly. Miss Marple took it with care, not with the trepidation of a woman handling something dangerous, but the reverence of someone uncovering the last piece of a puzzle she'd been turning in her mind for days. They stood in silence as she loosened the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside, beneath layers of soft cloth, was a wooden music box, the old-fashioned kind with a winding key and a hinged lid. Not valuable. Not new. But familiar. Miss Marple had seen it once before, years ago, on the writing desk in Reginald Braithwaite's study, nestled between a silver pen and a framed photograph of his children. A sentimental relic. A private object. Its presence here, wrapped and re-gifted like a bauble, sent a quiet shiver down her spine. She opened it. The music was faint, crackling slightly from age, a lullaby she did not recognize. But it was what lay beneath the velvet lining that drew her breath. A hidden compartment, barely detectable, it seemed invisible unless one knew to look. Within it was a letter, folded once, yellowed by time and sealed with wax now cracked from age. She lifted it slowly and read the inscription, "To be opened only in the event of my death." R. Braithwaite. Miss Marple's fingers stilled, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around her. Eleanor had gone still. and had drifted in from the corridor, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and stood watching like a ghost at the edge of a dream. "I believe," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but clear, "that this was meant to be found. And someone did not want it to be." She did not read the letter aloud. Not yet. Instead, she asked to take it with her, assuring Eleanor that it would be returned and promising, in a tone that brooked no protest, that she would treat it with the gravity it deserved. Back at her cottage, by the flickering hearth, Miss Marple opened the letter with the same care she might offer a confession or a prayer. The handwriting was Reginald's. Precise, deliberate. The letter was not long, but every word pulsed with meaning. He wrote of regret of a marriage entered in haste, annulled in secrecy, and then invalidated when it was discovered the annulment had never been legally filed. He wrote of Vivienne. Not cruelly, but with a detached acknowledgement of her role in a past he had tried to bury. He spoke of Eleanor, my saving grace, and of the children, of legacy, of how the truth could ruin them all. And then, most crucially, he mentioned the insurance policy adjusted just months ago to protect what remains mine. "I fear if anything should happen to me, others may use it as leverage. I trust Gregory to keep the files sealed. I trust no one else." Miss Marple sat back, heart-thudding. The policy had a clause, double indemnity for accidental death. And Reginald had feared precisely that his death might be exploited for gain, not merely by Vivienne, but by someone closer. Someone inside the house. Someone who stood to benefit from both silence and inheritance. Gregory Phelps had known. He had kept the documents. But he had been silenced before he could act. And Reginald Jr., who had found the old letters and financial records in Phelps's office, had disappeared just as he began to ask questions. The pattern was no longer a pattern. It was a design. And Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and sharper mind, could now see the edges of the truth. Vivienne had been the spark, but not the architect. Phelps had known the layout of the trap but not its bait. Reginald Jr. had wandered into it blind. But the letter, this gift, this posthumous confession, was the crack in the facade. And yet, she knew, one question remained. Who? She reviewed the letter again, searching not for what was said, but for what was not. The tone, the timing, the reference to trust or the lack thereof. And slowly, one image rose above the rest, the Christmas tree. The hidden gift. Someone had returned that music box to the Braithwaite house not in kindness, but in desperation. A mistake. An oversight. And one Miss Marple would not allow to go unanswered. She dressed again, pulling on boots and shawl, and walked back through the snow toward the Braithwaite house, this time not as a friend or visitor, but as a detective, one with all but the final note in a carol composed of lies. Enjoying murder in the carol? Don't forget to subscribe for the final, chilling chapter. Who do you think placed the music box beneath the tree? And who is desperate enough to kill for an inheritance? Share your theories below, we read every one. Chapter 10. Midnight Mass. The bells of St. Edward's tolled the hour with the solemnity of a cathedral, yet the village of St. Mary Mead stirred with a hush that was almost reverent. Midnight Mass had always been the crown jewel of the parish calendar, a ceremony of candlelight and carols, of whispered peace and familiar scripture, but this year, beneath the wreaths and polished brass, the air held a charge like the quiet before a storm. Snow lay thick and untroubled on the church roof, but within its stone walls a reckoning waited to unfold. Miss Marple, wrapped in her neat woolen coat with a red ribbon tied subtly at her throat, entered with unhurried grace, taking her usual place in the third pew, the same one where she had sat when the woman in red first tore open the village's facade of order and civility. But tonight, there would be no further whispers. Tonight, the truth would speak plainly. Not from the pulpit, but from the heart of darkness itself. The congregation trickled in slowly. Eleanor Braithwaite, composed but pale, her gloves buttoned tight, and trailing behind with downcast eyes and a white shawl like frost on her shoulders. Reverend Chilton adjusted his vestments with uncharacteristic tension, and even the altar boys seemed quieter than usual, their brass bells trembling slightly as they passed. A choir of 12 stood ready to sing "O Come, All Ye Faithful," but their voices, when they began, had a strained clarity, as though they, too, sensed that the holiness of the hour was shadowed by human deceit. Miss Marple did not sing. She listened. To the choir, to the wind tapping at the stained-glass windows, to the shuffle of shoes across ancient flagstones, and to the quiet shifting of gilt beside her. For in the second pew, just ahead of her, sat Harold Fletchley. Eleanor's brother, the man who had served as witness at her wedding to Reginald Braithwaite, the man who had moved in shortly after Reginald's death to assist with the estate, and the man whose quiet presence had gone largely unremarked by a village too distracted by the spectacle of Vivienne's red dress and the shock of sudden deaths. The sermon came and went, brief, tender, filled with the usual homilies about hope and light and the miracle of beginnings. But when the choir began its final carol, Silent Night, Miss Marple stood. Slowly, gently, with the soft firmness of a woman who had made up her mind. She turned not to the pulpit, but to the pews, her voice low but unmistakable. "I am terribly sorry to interrupt again," she said, "but as we gather to speak of truth and light, I feel it only right to reveal a darkness that has settled among us, a darkness disguised in kindness and wrapped, most cruelly, in ribbon and tinsel." There was a ripple of discomfort. The music faltered. Reverend Chilton stepped down from the pulpit with a furrowed brow, but Miss Marple raised one hand and continued. "3 deaths have visited our village in the space of a week. Vivienne Braithwaite, whose bold claim cast doubt upon a legacy many hoped to preserve, Gregory Phelps, who died with brandy and secrets in his throat, and Reginald Braithwaite Jr., whose disappearance has yet to be resolved but who, I believe, is no longer among the living. Each one stood in the way of a story being rewritten. Each one knew a piece of the truth. And each one threatened to undo the work of a man who has hidden his ambition behind the comforting veil of family obligation." Gasps. One woman clutched her pearls. Harold shifted but did not stand. Miss Marple's eyes settled on him with quiet, devastating clarity. "Harold Fletchley, it is my belief that you orchestrated these events, not in madness, nor in haste, but with careful, cold intention. You stood to inherit through your sister, through the revised insurance policy, and you acted to ensure that nothing, not an old marriage, not a solicitor's conscience, not even a grieving son, would stand in your way." Eleanor's head turned sharply. "No," she whispered. But her voice trembled with something more fragile than denial, dawning horror. "Harold. Tell her it's not true." But Harold did not speak. He stared ahead, hands folded too tightly, breath too shallow. Miss Marple pressed on. "You tampered with church records. You paid, through a donation recorded in December 1978, to remove the bans that would have made Vivienne's marriage public. You removed a page from the marriage registry itself. You poisoned Gregory with fruitcake soaked in brandy laced with digitalis. You placed the music box beneath the tree in hopes the letter would be destroyed with the wrapping paper. And as for Reginald Jr., I suspect you arranged for him to meet with someone, perhaps under the guise of revealing more information, and there, he was silenced. His body has yet to be found, but his absence is too precise to be chance. The room had frozen. Only the candles flickered. The choir stood mute, hymn books clasped like shields. And then, suddenly, Harold stood. His voice was low, even. "You have no proof." But Miss Marple smiled gently. "No. You see, that is where you miscalculated. You believed no one would go digging in the church ledgers. You counted on Phelps keeping the policy locked away. And you never imagined your own handwriting would give you away on a donation page, in the wrong ink, with your exact flourish on the letter H. It was carelessness born of arrogance, Mr. Fletchley. A belief that no one would look behind the carols." He lunged then, not at her, but toward the side aisle, toward the sacristy door that led to the rear exit. But the constable was already there, summoned hours earlier by a note from Miss Marple, and Harold was intercepted not with violence but with quiet, practiced restraint. He did not struggle long. He merely looked back once, at Eleanor, at the pews, at the candles. And then he was led away. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple sat once more. The carol resumed, this time softer, more tentative, as though the church itself needed to remember how to sing. Eleanor did not move. Nor did Anne. But something shifted in the air, not peace, perhaps, but the beginning of honesty. Later, as the congregation filed out beneath the falling snow, someone whispered, "She did it again, didn't she?" And another replied, "She always does. And in such a quiet way." At her cottage, Miss Marple placed the music box gently on her mantel, beside her knitting basket and the unopened tin of cinnamon biscuits someone had left on her doorstep. She did not need applause. Only peace. And perhaps, in time, a bit of silence that was truly silent, not simply the space where guilt was hiding. Because, even at Christmas, or perhaps especially, the truth must come in from the cold. Thank you for joining Murder in the Carol, a Miss Marple Christmas mystery. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for future serialized mysteries, leave your thoughts or favorite moments in the comments, and share with fellow cozy crime lovers. Justice, after all, is best served warm with a shawl, a cup of tea, and just a touch of sleigh bells.